By talking about the craft of fiction in such detail, we do not want to give the impression that writing is all mechanical. To the contrary, we want to suggest that good writing is spontaneous, it's free, and it's very largely intuitive. So a lot of what goes on in fiction is subconscious, and critics, when they're looking at fiction, they are amused and they appreciate the subconscious element in fiction. It is that subconscious element in fiction which lifts it up beyond simple mechanic or simple craft. Nonetheless, we believe that writers who are starting out, they ought to know the rudiments of writing, the basics of the craft. So in that connection, we've been talking about character, place, and time. And now that you have started writing, you might look at how you have invented the character, how you have placed the character in a location, and how you have created a sense of history in terms of time. Now, in the last session, we invented a story together, a story about a boy and a girl in a small town in Fiji. They're going to school together and later marrying. Now, that is a very simple story. We do not want to suggest that there is a short story. It's simply a story. We want to make a distinction between a story and a short story. And that is a very important distinction. In the same way, we might want to make a distinction between movies and films. Now, movies are what you see every day in the theaters around the city. Now, film is something that comes occasionally. Now, that's a kind of discussion we might engage in later. But today, I want to talk about the distinction between the story and short story. A story is what happens in the piece that you are writing. Stories are events, and events are connected together through cause and effect. There's something that happens at the beginning of story, and that which happens has connection with what happens subsequently. So the events in a story are connected, they're linked together. And they are linked together how? They are linked together through the elements that we have been discussing, the element of character, the element of place, and the element of time. Now, what is the distinction between that which is simply a story and a short story? The distinction is that short story is an art form. What lifts the story from mere narrative to a short story is the use of language. And the same way as the distinction can be made between a movie and a film. Film uses the language of cinema, and there is a particular language of cinema that good filmmakers, they master. In the same way, a competent short story writer also masters the art of using language. The language that the short story writer uses is a literary language. Now you have to pause a little bit and find out what do we mean by literary language. It is the literariness of the story that makes it a short story, an art form. And by literary use of language, we mean the use of metaphors, the use of symbols, the use of imagery, and some of the poetic devices such as alliteration, repetition, assonance, dissonance. Now, I do not have the time to go into details defining these terms. I would expect the practicing writer to look up these terms. Not only look up the terms, but also find examples from their reading. Now, you may be thinking that because you're using English as a second language, and I presume that a lot of you who are writing, you use English as a second language. Your mother tongue is something else, perhaps Hindi or Itoke language or Tamil or Japanese, whatever it may be. Now, you should not feel that because you're using English as a second language, you will not reach that competent level where you are able to use language in a literary way. Because if you look around, some of the great writers, whether in the West or elsewhere, you find that they have used English as a second language and achieved something very great. A name that comes to mind is Joseph Conrad, who has written some of the great novels in the English language, and English was not his first language. He learned English after he was about 21 years old. And when we turn to Africa, we turn to the Indian subcontinent, we find many writers who have written and gained international recognition using English as a second language. R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao, Chinua Achebe, and many other writers, Arundhati Roy. And when we turn to the Pacific itself, to Fiji, you find a number of writers who have used English as a second language and gained international recognition. I would expect you to read these writers and gain inspiration from these writers. Now, short story writing is a challenging form. Now, there's some misconception that until you begin to write novels, you're not a writer. You should get rid of that misconception, because short story writing is a challenging form. And recently, the writer who has won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Alice Munro from Canada, is a short story writer. And her short story writing have been recognized internationally. And what is great about Alice Munro that won her the Nobel Prize is that she is able to write extraordinary stories about ordinary events. And that is also inspiring for beginning writers. You may say that the events that you know are so ordinary. How could you make fiction out of it? How can you make great fiction out of it? Now you can turn to Alice Munro. She writes about very ordinary daily events, and what she is able to achieve is something astonishing. We will carry on with this discussion of the distinction between story and short story in subsequent sessions.